Hi, welcome to our first digital seminar for co-organized by Emer and Bergen Global. So this will be the first of hopefully a series of webinars that we will do during or given the current circumstances. Today we have Sarah Tobin. She will be talking about the coronavirus prevention and its impact on Syrian refugees or Syrians who live in camps in Jordan. You can leave in questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom. And for those actually watching us on YouTube, they can also leave in some questions there and we will receive them. For now, I'll leave the word to Sarah. So you may start now.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you may be. I am going to get my screen up here and the PowerPoint going for you. This is always just a little bit strange getting things rolling the first time, but hopefully we will get moving. Thank you all for joining today. This is a real honor and a real joy to be sharing with you a little bit about what I've been learning about the quickly changing situation in Jordan and the impacts that we've seen so far and the anticipated impacts that we hope or expect or don't or worry perhaps might be seen into the future. There's a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty, and we're all living amidst that. And I think it's important to continue reaching out to understand how that uncertainty might be impacting others differently than us throughout the globe. So I want to start by just saying a big thank you for putting this together at the last minute and a bit unexpectedly, given how quickly things are changing for us. So University of Bergen Global, CMI, Eimer, Mani Salem has been a wonderful supporter of these kinds of events for several semesters, and we appreciate so much her work. Anya and Tord for their tech help. And especially a big shout out to my friends in Jordan who have been helping me to understand the quickly changing context and impact like Esrathia. I also want to take a moment to thank those whose early work on the topic has provided vital in understanding the situation in Jordan. Recently, POMEPS and Mark Lynch have put out a new issue called The COVID-19 Pandemic in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's excellent. I highly recommend everyone taking a look at the essays in that issue, including those by Alison Spencer Hartnett, El Natour, El Janouni, Elizabeth Parker Magyar, Adam Hoffman, Justin Schoen, and then the Merripp pieces recently authored by Reva Dingra and Amanda Lee. There's also a number of journalists who are providing really amazing work on the ground every day in the middle of these very trying times. And I applaud very much the work that they're doing. When I traveled to Jordan on Monday, February 3rd, the signs of security and surveillance for the novel coronavirus were already in force. As my Air France flight from Paris began its descent, the pilot announced that anyone with a fever would be put into quarantine immediately at El Bashir Hospital. While no one in the airport was checking temperatures, at least I saw, the message was clear. By entering Jordan's border, you're consenting to this enhanced security. If you were ill or might have been ill, the Jordanian state became the deciding factor in next steps and transmission prevention, able to lock you down into a hospital or later a hotel as they saw fit. This is, of course, the way that many, if not most, states have securitized their borders and enacted new emergency domestic policies of COVID transmission prevention. The complicating factor in Jordan, however, is that in addition to extremely limited healthcare infrastructure, the country is defined by a large number of refugees. By most estimations, more than 50% of the country is demographically a refugee. Of those, upwards of 750,000 are Syrian, who are already living quite precariously. So in this talk today, I'll discuss what's happened in Jordan more generally, and when the security state started invoking emergency powers to limit the spread of coronavirus, what it's meant for Syrian refugees in terms of further limiting the spread of the novel coronavirus, and by also limiting access to larger labor and education markets, information flows, and the economic and political prospects into the future. So it was a month after I had arrived in Jordan and before the first positive COVID test was documented. And 2 weeks after that, on March 14th, it was announced that the government was going to close its borders, schools, and non-essential businesses. Residents were legally bound to stay home beginning on March 17th for 3 days. Lockdown enforced by police countrywide in the form of arrests, officials making rounds, and road closure checkpoints. They looked something like this. Leaving one's home at this time became a crime, with police actively arresting those violating the terms, including dramatic chase scenes such as this one.
Ay, مسكوه. هاي مسكوه. هاي مسكوه. والله مسكوهم.
In fact, as of March 24th, 1,657 Jordanians had been arrested for breaking curfew, and 600 cars had been impounded for violating the no transportation laws. Irbid in the north was under military lockdown. It emerged as a coronavirus hotspot due to a wedding that took place on March 13th, which was the night before the government announcement of closures, because the bride's sister had visited from Canada and then was responsible for infecting 26 new people. These events prompted those with smartphones and a sense of humor to post videos such as this one of a man risking arrest to leave his house in order to put the trash at the local collection point, with the voiceover of a goal scored during a football match.
يعطي الكرة للسلام وينه كانت باين هرب شوت كانت باين يدخل منطقة الجزاء جول كل الدلال.
Compared to other countries, Jordan's response has been tough. The three-pronged approach of first, a nationwide curfew, closed borders, secondly, and thirdly, active military patrols with active arrests is considered one of the world's toughest. However, as of that time, there were registered just over 100 positive COVID tests. As of Sunday, just 2 days ago, a month later now, Jordan has registered less than 450 cases with a daily growth of only 4 to 10 cases on average. So why has the Jordanian government been so tough? The first reason is that such measures can be and are justified by reference to the Jordanian healthcare system's capacity. Hospitals have only 1.4 beds per 1,000 people, which is lower than the global average. The second reason is that Jordan's government has a well-developed coercive capacity and martial strength. As Adam Hoffman discusses in his article for the POMET issue I mentioned, this approach of playing to one's strengths of emergency governance with the military in Jordan tries to make up for the lower capacities for governance in other areas such as bureaucratic or civil strengths that we see in other countries, such as Norway, like the invocation of the dugnad here as a kind of civil service or service to society. As of Saturday, March 21st, the first siren rang out throughout the country of Jordan, signaling an indefinite curfew and homebound lockdown and the closing of the businesses. It lifted a bit on March 25th, but only then to allow young and middle-aged adults to leave their homes to purchase food at local grocers between the hours of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., as well as to go to the hospitals. And they may only do so when traveling on foot because of the ban on cars. The curfew siren rings nightly still at 6 p.m. every night, signifying the shifting of everyday rhythms of Jordan from traffic jams and crowds and Friday night weddings to the echoes of the regular call to prayer against virtually empty streets and the daily siren telling everyone to go home again. This has prompted some to suggest that the two should be done simultaneously because of this unexpected volume and jarring impact of the new soundscape. More practically, however, in the midst of this, the government has launched a whirlwind series of policies and plans and social orders. Initially, there was a comprehensive plan to distribute bread, medicines, groceries, and even cigarettes, neighborhood by neighborhood. Some distribution points were orderly and social distancing was maintained, but others, especially impoverished neighborhoods, did not fare so well. So the government quickly responded by changing policies over and again to better meet the needs and interests of the people while still maintaining a strong military and martial presence despite COVID. So in the POMET's issue that I mentioned earlier, here's a timeline of the policy instruments that have been invoked in sort of this first lockdown, and then it opens for certain people and what hours and what days. I mean, it's changing so quickly that it can be very difficult to keep up with. In fact, finding a single timeline, this was the only place I was able to find one. So even just understanding the linear projection of these things can be very difficult. This does fit a larger kind of bureaucratic practice in Jordan that we've seen in other instances, laws changing quickly, circulars distributed, but people not really knowing the most recent laws because of the speed of change. However, this is where the pre-existing vulnerabilities come to the fore for both Jordanians and Syrians alike. In 2019 and 2020, the Jordanian government had planned to move away from the previous 8 years of austerity policies implemented by the World Bank and IMF, and instead expand welfare policies through moves such as sales tax exemptions and new economic stimulus packages. In the POMEP's essay by Alison Spencer Hartnett, El Natour, and Laithel Ejlouni, the COVID-related economic losses have surely wiped away budget lines that could have otherwise improved public services for all residents in Jordan, including Syrian refugees and others in the areas of health and education. Before the pandemic, economic life in Jordan was poor at best. Over 15% of Jordanians lived under the poverty line, an unemployment rate of nearly 40% amongst youth, and 46% of workers were employed in informal or non-regularized labor. The sector has now experienced tremendous losses. The strongest impact has been felt amongst day laborers and informal sector workers. COVID-related unemployment is now estimated at over 70%. In the public sector, which is considered historically enviable, secure employment, has seen a 25% job loss, and nearly another 50% of people in the survey cited income loss due to COVID. In addition to a loss of income, price increases and inflation on goods immediately went into effect countrywide. While the government is trying to limit price gouging and enforce price ceilings, as well as limit the exporting of certain foodstuffs, fresh foods and vegetables in particular, the market has responded to the rush and at times profiting quite greatly. All signs point to continued economic hardship, which is a bad situation made even worse by these measures. Education is another sector in which Jordanian society has been hit hard. With school closures, the attempts to change to remote learning have been met by limited and poor quality internet, a lack of electricity, especially in the refugee camps, and a lack of technology at home. The government shifted to teaching the national curriculum to a TV program-based offering. And the government has also aimed to increase electricity at home to help facilitate at-home schooling, both of which showed an increase in access to the learning programs to 33% of the country's children. So it was an important move. So this is from Jordan TV, from their Facebook page. They broadcast the schedule for all of the grades for the students from first grade until secondary, each day and each hour, and what lessons they're offering. So a television-based programming proved to be a very important move in improving the access to education for all, including refugees. The experiences of the wider Jordanian society are felt perhaps even more acutely by Syrian refugee populations in Jordan. Most of the refugees of these 750,000 live in the northern area. So here's a map with the highest concentrations in the regions of Irbid and Mafraq. As Justin Schoen begins to point out in his article in the POMEP's piece, there are three major challenges to protecting Syrian refugees in the Middle East in general, and specifically, I argue, in Jordan, from coronavirus through one, the virus itself, number two, the grinding poverty that's made worse in this context, and number three, the particular vulnerability that Syrian refugees may have to misinformation in this process. So firstly, the vulnerability to the virus. This is an important one to consider. Now, I have to add a disclaimer here. I'm not a medical doctor, but I have read some early conjectures that these kinds of patterns may be the case. But I'm not a medical doctor, so this is not a field of expertise for me, but other people have been writing on these ideas. The Syrians tend to be younger and comprised of more females than males, which could actually make them, demographically speaking, at a lower risk of morbidity to COVID and coronavirus, as it's the males and older populations that are dying more quickly from the virus than others. By contrast, however, those Syrians in Jordan also have higher rates of comorbidities through chronic illness, for which they receive more intensive medical care than their Jordanian counterparts, including things like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic respiratory diseases, which, as we know, are confounding and comorbidities in the coronavirus expressions. So while Syrians tend to be younger and more likely female, they're also more likely to live with these conditions of comorbidities. So what that means for Syrian morbidity from coronavirus, I think is obviously yet to be determined, but it could really go, I think, either way. Secondly, Syrians in Jordan tend to live in high density areas, especially Jordan's northern cities and then the poorest areas of Amman and other urban areas, with less than 15% of Syrian refugees living in camps. In addition to challenges to social distancing in high population density areas, water shortages continue to plague Jordan, which is a water poor country, one of the worst in the world, making frequent hand washing a distinct challenge. According to Revadingra's piece, 2/3 of households living in Jordan's Syrian refugee camps have more than 3 people per room, making effective self-isolation impossible. Social distancing in public is also difficult in the 2 densely populated main camps of Zaatari and Azraq. In urban areas, Syrian refugees live in similarly crowded settings with dwellings consisting of 2 or 3 rooms for households of 5 or more. One neighborhood in urban Amman, Hashmi Shemeli, is home to a large portion of the city's poorest refugees, and it is now on complete lockdown due to its status as a virus hotspot. Poverty further compounds this. Approximately 80% of Syrian refugees live under the poverty line before the lockdown measures and before coronavirus, and only 2% have any household savings. Most refugees do not therefore have the means to stock up on supplies necessary for a lockdown. Specifically for Syrian refugees, the labor market sectors they most frequently occupy are construction, agriculture, manufacturing, retail, and food service. These service sector jobs are not compatible with work from home demands. In addition, most of the labor is informal, and so they are just simply out of income. For those in the refugee camps, their hard-earned mobility out of the camps, this is years in the making to get regular access out of the camps and work permits to do so, but that hard-earned mobility out of the camps for work is now entirely closed to them. The camps are sealed off from outside contact entirely. Supply chains continue for food into the camp and other necessary infrastructural support, but the earlier fears or the earliest fears of open-air prisons of Zaatari and Azraq are being felt distinctly under this lockdown. Syrians in the camps are also asked to remain at home and practice social distancing from their neighbors, adding to concerns about increases in domestic violence and children's absence from schooling. Many Syrian refugees have reported that they don't know what to do if they develop symptoms or want to report a suspected case. While Syrians in Jordan have received subsidized access to government hospitals, one report I read indicated that 82% of Syrian refugees reported needing to borrow money in order to access urgent health care. We can assume that the costs of healthcare treatment would drive at least some Syrians away from formal hospitalized care and into self-care and at-home treatment. However, this leads to a third vulnerability, and that's a vulnerability to misinformation. As an American, I would like to apologize for the vast amount of misinformation about at-home medical treatments that have been put forth by Donald Trump. It's undeniably harmful for everyone around the world. This misinformation about at-home treatments, however, is something that Syrian refugees may especially be vulnerable to in Jordan. Nearly all of the interviews that my projects have been involved in, including the Traffic Project, Research Council of Norway funded projects, and others, have demonstrated that Syrians are often reticent and hesitant and afraid even to attract too much attention to themselves, believing that it's a kind of security risk. Syrians in Jordan are sensitive about their security, and being the first Syrian refugee to test positive for COVID not only would raise their profile then within Jordan, but also internationally and perhaps even with the Assad regime in Syria. Many Syrians I've met would be extremely fearful of seeking medical attention, preferring instead to turn to at-home remedies that might work, in part because the President of the United States says so. The Jordanian government has worked hard to counter misinformation and encourage an environment in which adherence to the law is the norm. There are now legal penalties for spreading misinformation, and the government is countering misinformation through daily news briefings and even open Facebook pages with announcement and information vetted by science. However, this vulnerability is perhaps the most treacherous, both among Syrian refugees and beyond. I just wanted to read this quote that I found from a UNHCR publication that I think really emphasizes this. This is Ahmed Harb. This is the paragraph in the middle of your screen. It says, he says, it's completely quiet. I do not hear voices in my neighborhood anymore, only silence. The market's different, everything is different. He's in Zaatari. People are terrified because it's a new thing that they don't know much about, and it's a disease that can spread very fast. So this fear, I think, really does drive the vulnerability to misinformation, and understandably so. So in conclusion, I want to discuss the economic and political prospects for Jordan moving forward. The flow of international assistance to Jordan has been slow or stopped entirely for a large number of refugee and non-refugee families alike. NGOs have cut many non-essential programs such as sanitation and healthcare to shift resources to providing basic food security and shelter provisions. Jordanian municipalities, who also host the largest number of Syrian refugees, have had to shift their available resources from programs for the greater community good, from solid waste disposal to water treatment, in order to increase their own stocks of PPE. 60 million euro initially earmarked for refugee health and education is now going to support Jordan's coronavirus response. Jordan's economy depends on this aid, but so do the refugees' livelihoods. And this reapportionment of aid away from the areas in which they would more immediately benefit, especially in the urban areas, means that the Syrians will be feeling these effects more acutely and for a longer period of time than their Jordanian neighbors. This pandemic has exacerbated a decades-long trend of increasing economic precarity for the Jordanian labor force. And without a serious reopening of the service sector for many months to come, Syrians will be forced to remain outside the labor force then even longer. Despite this dire economic outlook, however, the lockdown has been met with large praise and support for the government from all sectors of society. As this image shows, Prime Minister Omar Razaz, who's in the middle, is featured there with ministers of health, media, labor, finance, and industry and trade. And the current leaders have largely been met with support and a language of military heroism. The government has been responsive to concerns about coronavirus, that is true, but it has shown these new personalities that have connected with the public in an unusual way that often defy government official stereotypes as cringeworthy or condescending. This is particularly the case with Saad Jabr, who is just over the word heroes next to the prime minister, so second to the right. There's a lot of really interesting and noteworthy information about him. He's the Minister of Health, and he's been touted as the George Clooney meets the Dr. Fauci of Jordan. The sort of soothing voice, speaking truth, not condescending, not cringeworthy, but also a relatively attractive and smart older man has captured the attention and interest. And the sort of new face of government attention and information in Jordan has proved really important in spreading good information and the correct information and reassuring the public. It has been both a military boon, but also a kind of symbolic boon for this current government. So as Mark Lynch points out in an article he's written, there's a well-grounded concern that autocratic regimes throughout the Middle East, and not just Jordan, would use these emergency powers to also repress political opposition. The emergency response and the society's acceptance thereof has legitimated and escalated state control over society in ways that are necessary, of course, to slow the virus transmission, but which also incorporate all the tools and modalities for future repression. As political historians often point out, emergency laws once put into place are unlikely to retreat, especially in the highly security conscious regimes of the Middle East and North Africa. Mark Lynch continues, quote, "The lessons about the ability to clear the streets, the technology to track citizen movements, the legal authorities to implement lockdowns, all of these are equally useful against political opponents as they are against the virus," end quote. Nonetheless, the longer political impacts will be understood through the lens of the economy. With long-term economic costs, the very drivers of further unrest and dissent are sure to be fueled. The ability to mobilize resources to counter them will once again be divided between calculations of public health or education, or municipal services versus stocks of PPE. Syrian refugees are sure to bear the brunt of these calculations, both in Jordan and beyond. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take the questions. So it looks like the first question is, what about the measures UNHCR or the government has been taken in order to prevent the spreading of COVID inside the camp? Are there any reception centers for Syrian refugees activated in Jordan? So as I mentioned, the main measure that the government has taken has been to first lock down the camps. So continuing supply chains for goods, but the mobility of people in and out of the camps has been curtailed. Are there any reception centers for Syrian refugees activated in Jordan, as in new reception centers? Not that I know of. However, I would certainly be open to hearing more about any that have been that you might be aware of. Another comment says, thank you so much for this presentation, very interesting. Are Syrian refugees going back to Syria, or are they leaving for other countries now under the COVID outbreak? This is a really important question. As far as I know, the Syrians are not going back to Syria, but that was happening prior to the COVID outbreak. As for resettlement to third countries, this is a real issue. IOM and a number of other organizations, including UNHCR, have essentially suspended their resettlement policies until further notice. And so, for some of the most vulnerable who have been granted resettlement, it means a longer wait to get into a situation of more security and less vulnerability. And that's really the challenge, is trying to figure out how to provide safety and security for some of the most vulnerable, but not having the ability to cross country borders. Are there any other questions? So there's a couple more that have popped up. I was wondering whether you could say something about the role of NGOs vis-a-vis the state. Has it changed? As far as I know, generally speaking, not tremendously. The NGOs operate under the support of Ministry of the Interior. And, in this kind of emergency situation, Ministry of the Interior has dedicated their, information and their services towards COVID response more than they have towards other kinds of support. So I would venture, although I have to read up on this a little bit more, that the NGOs are left to kind of continue what they can do within the boundaries of the laws. And so one instance I was reading about is Collateral Repair Project operates in a poor area of Amman, where there's a high number of refugees from all over, Iraqis, a high number of Iraqis in particular, but also Yemenis and Sudanese and Somalis, in addition to Syrians. And they were describing that the donations that they've received has cut their ability to support food for families. So they were providing support to 1,000 families, and they had to cut it to 500. And then when the COVID outbreak happened and there was lockdown, they had to, they were unable to physically go print the vouchers and distribute them to the families so that they could take the vouchers to their local shops in order to get the food. And so the NGO had to do a kind of workaround and work directly with the local groceries, so the grocers could provide the food to the families on credit. But this is a small NGO, relatively speaking, operating within a well-known neighborhood and in a well-known space. And so I think the problem of, when you start scaling up, you actually run a bigger risk of families falling through the cracks and not being able to negotiate these kinds of economic arrangements on behalf of refugees, right? If you are unable to get the sort of large-scale credit-based purchase of foodstuffs, for refugee families, then people are going to really suffer. And so there are these instances of pockets of NGOs, I think, working to sort of fill those gaps within the law. But generally speaking, I think there hasn't been a change in status of NGOs or anything kind of large like that. So the next question is, the responses from the government are the same for residents and refugees? Yes. The information that I've seen is that this is regardless of your status in relation to the government, these same laws apply to everyone. And so that's why the Syrians have suffered, I think, a just kind of disproportionate or more acute kind of economic hardship because of the lockdown is because they did not have access to some of the same regularized labor that citizens and others with work permits and kind of durable status had. Looking forward to talking with you as well, Jan, into the future. Jan had to leave, but this is very interesting. Okay, so the follow-up questions, are the responses from the government more strict for refugees? They are for the refugees in the camp, but not outside of the camp. Outside of the camps, it's a kind of, it's the same policy, across the board. So within the camps and in and out of the camps is the main difference in terms of like mobility restrictions. So a question that came into from YouTube, many Jordanians and also Syrian refugees are temporarily working in other countries. Has the Jordanian government made efforts to return them home? Not that I know of, though I would certainly be interested to hear if other people have more information. The Jordanians, yes, have been repatriated in many instances from countries all over the world, including this very sort of famous flight that came from Wuhan directly, a plane full of Jordanians, just as the lockdowns were starting. So, but in terms of like Syrian refugees and other countries being repatriated to Jordan, I don't know how that would necessarily happen. I've not heard of that kind of move on the part of the Jordanian government. But I suppose if they had some kind of residency or tie to Jordan, it might be possible, but I have a hard time kind of envisioning how that could work. But for citizens, yes, repatriation has been something I've seen. So another question here is the measures inside the camp. Okay, so we're back to this thread about differences in camps and outside the camp. I mean, if you will only lock down people while no one can come in or out, will prevent the virus from spreading out. But what if the virus spread inside? Are there any prepared facilities? Is the health organization making tests for refugees? So inside Zatari or inside Azraq. So at this point, the government has said that there are no cases of Syrians having contracted COVID. At least that is the last number that I saw. Of course, this is a very rapidly changing kind of situation. So are there facilities inside the camp? I mean, at this point, though, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it is just a lockdown and a kind of wait and see. The camps do have medical facilities throughout. So in Zatari, for example, there's a hospital that's run by the French. There's a hospital run by the Saudis. There are health facilities run by a wide variety of NGOs, Doctors Without Borders, et cetera, who would be prepared to do, testing and screening. Absolutely, 100%. But are there specific, like additional sort of measures? There haven't registered, cases yet of Syrians, and so I think beyond an anticipation of testing and whatnot, there are not additional measures that are sort of proactively taken. I think the lockdown was the primary means of preventing the spread of COVID from coming into the camp, and thus far, a month plus later, there have not been any recorded cases within the camp. Thanks, Omar, for those questions. I hope that clarifies. I do see an earlier comment that a request that I slow down a little, so I do apologize for not seeing that and not being able to keep the pace a little bit slower. It's exciting information, and so I hope that it was clear nonetheless. The next question is the government providing data on how many tests they are performing? Because maybe it could be that they are under testing inside the camp. They do provide that data, but I honestly did not dig deep into that. They are documenting how many tests they have, how many, governments around the world. I mean, I guess in theory, it's possible that they're just not testing people in the camps, but then we would see a notable rise in morbidity, or at least an sort of unexpected, rise in death rates in the camps. And I think that would be hard to hide or hard to miss somehow. I think people are on the lookout for it, to be sure. And as many Jordanians joke, the entire country's become one WhatsApp group. That it's a place where people know each other and know sort of what's going on, and it's a difficult place. It's a difficult country. It's a tight-knit country. It's a difficult place, I think, to hide that kind of data, that kind of information, if you're going to have a rise in illness, a striking rise in illness and morbidity. So I suppose it's possible that the government is just simply not testing inside the camps. But I think, I mean, my feeling is that given how swiftly and quickly the government moved to lock down the country, it's more likely the case that there are just not any positives within the camps yet. So I think that's the more likely scenario, to be honest. I find this information really interesting, and I would be happy to speak with any of you one-on-one, Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, whatever, or exchange, have an email exchange, information exchange. I'm happy to continue taking questions. One thing I wanted to mention is that Ramadan has now started. And I think that it's a challenge. You know, there's not a clear sense of what exactly that means for a lot of different people. It means that kind of everyday life is continuing much like it has under the lockdown, which is that, you know, there's limited opportunities to leave the house. People are sort of homebound with their families. I understand the Saudi soap opera this season has been extremely controversial. So there's television and there's kind of a rhythm to Ramadan this year that is providing some solace. But of course, it's difficult to not have iftars, with larger families. So there's a lot of, like, you know, internet-based or phone-based kind of family connections, which is a change. I think the biggest struggle is going to be what to do at the end of Ramadan with the Eid holiday. You know, how to make not only the foodstuffs available widely within the country, but also what to do with the kind of festive nature of it and the holiday. So I think that's a really important consideration. So a couple more questions. Let's see. Oh, somebody was interested in some of the articles that I cited. And let's see, if I write something, all panelists and attendees. So the POMEPS piece that I mentioned, that's the project on Middle East political science, edited by Mark Lynch. And the typing and talking. The name of the issue that he just put out is called the COVID-19 pandemic in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm abbreviating Middle East and North Africa. So the variety of essays in there is very good. They span a wide variety of countries. So if you're interested in what else is happening throughout the region, the essay on Yemen is excellent. There's a lot of references to a lot of security state kinds of efforts and interests that are going on. So it's politically science oriented. The others that I would mention are Reva Dhingra, and she has written in MERIP, which is the Middle East Research and Information Project, and Amanda Lane in the same issue of MERIP. Those are some of the most, I think, really important kind of academic critical sources that are coming out. So back to the questions of the camps. Is mobility restricted inside the camp? So yes, social distancing. Okay, so there's a different kind of element I think happening here. One is that Azraq already has restricted mobility within the camp. And that's because of the security situation. There's District 5, which is an area of the camp that is restricted for the residents who are undergoing a security screening because they have come from ISIS-controlled areas of Syria. So they're able to get processed through that security clearance, and then they move to another district. So there is some very limited mobility within the camp in the case of Azraq. That was in place before COVID. In the case of Zaatari, there was no limited mobility within the camp. Now, in both cases, the government is really restricting mobility, of course, in and out of the camps. But within the camps, the mobility is restricted in Azraq as it was before. And in Zaatari, it's the same. I mean, it's not restricted formally, but there are very strong recommendations that people socially distance from their neighbors. So in one report I read, there was a some signs that people were putting up on their tents or caravans or homes or their place of residence that said no visitors welcome, and really closing off any kind of interactions with others. The COVID has really it's a fearful thing for a lot of people, especially people who are in a health kind of precarious position. And so they're taking very conservative measures, but is it a kind of formal restriction? Not that I am aware of. Provisions of services inside the camps. Yeah, so it remains, I think, very similar to before. So at least in the case of Zaatari, for example, most of the NGO workers stayed in an area called HQ that they called. So that's where the camp kind of administration was. So it was not the case that all these Jordanian workers with NGOs were coming in and moving around the camp so freely. It's largely been the case that they come and work in their HQ, kind of their NGO headquarters offices, and then going into the camp as needed. And so I think that limited mobility means that that there's little interaction between NGO workers and Syrians. It's much more the case, for example, Questscope does this very well, where they enable and empower Syrians to be leaders of the NGO with other Syrians, so that the interactions with Jordanians are actually quite limited. So services then would continue, right? If it's led by Syrians for Syrians, then those kinds of services would continue. But the schools have been shut down. The UNHCR schools, the other sort of facilities in which there are large gatherings of people. So that's that's a real issue when it comes to concerns, for example, about education. Food provision, the supply chains continue, as I mentioned. The main concern was about price gouging. So that happened immediately. There's already concerns by many Syrians about higher prices for groceries within the NGOs, within the camps, but the NGOs have been working really hard and the government to limit price gouging and to try to provide for all of the refugees in the camps. Have they said when they will start reopening the camps? Not that I've heard. No, I think that I did see a projection yesterday that Jordan would have, at the current rate of infection, that they could be, much like New Zealand announced yesterday, they could be corona-free within about a month's time if they continue at the same rate. Of course, and then other measures need to be put into place. But I think it was the end of May or perhaps early June, if I remember correctly, that the rate would decrease enough that they could go back to business as usual, like most countries I think would be keen to do, but might not be able to do. So when will they start reopening the camps for the refugees? It's hard to say, and that's the real issue. Is this uncertainty that we're all living under is just really, I think, very acute for Syrian refugees. They're already living under conditions of uncertainty and precarity, and it's further compounded by this uncertainty that you don't know who might have the virus or who you're interacting with, which makes this vulnerability even more pronounced. All right, well, it doesn't seem like there are any more questions. Feel free to email me, sarah.tobin@cmi.no, and I'd be happy to share with you any additional information. Also, if you have any comments or further information to share with me, I'd be delighted to take it. So thank you all very much for coming, and I look forward to hearing from you all again soon.